The rain was pounding against the stained glass windows of Mount Calvary Baptist Church as I stood in the empty sanctuary, holding the deed to the building in my trembling hands. 32 years had passed since Pastor Williams looked down at my 8-year-old face and said the words that would haunt me for decades. "Some people don't belong in God's house, child, and you're one of them." Now, at 40 years old, I owned every brick, every pew, every window of the place that once made me feel worthless. But this story isn't about revenge. It's about something far more powerful. It's about how sometimes the very place that breaks you becomes the foundation for your greatest triumph. And it's about discovering that the voice of one hateful man could never silence the voice of God, speaking through a little black girl who refused to give up. My name is Maya Thompson, and this is the story of how shame became my strength, how rejection became my purpose, and how a church that didn't want me became the cornerstone of my calling. Before we dive into this incredible journey, I want to thank you for clicking on this video. Stories like Maya's need to be heard, shared, and remembered. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. And I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment and tell me your city or country. Your support helps us share more powerful stories of triumph, redemption, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Now let's begin Maya's remarkable journey. Maya Thompson was born in 1983 in the small town of Millfield, Georgia, population 3,200. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where secrets traveled faster than the Sunday morning church bells, and where your family's reputation could follow you for generations. Maya's mother, Janet, was a single parent who worked double shifts at the local diner to make ends meet. Despite their financial struggles, Janet made sure Maya understood two things: the importance of education and the power of faith. Every Sunday morning, without fail, they would walk the 6 blocks from their small apartment to Mount Calvary Baptist Church. Mount Calvary wasn't just any church in Millfield, it was the church. Founded in 1892, it sat on the town's main street like a white stone monument to tradition and respectability. The building itself was magnificent, with towering spires, intricate stained glass windows, and enough space to seat 400 people. Most Sundays, every seat was filled. The congregation was predominantly white, reflecting the demographics of Millfield itself. There were maybe 15 black families who attended regularly, and they had found their place in the community through years of quiet integration and careful navigation of unspoken social rules. Janet Thompson had been attending Mount Calvary since she moved to Millfield in 1982. Pregnant and alone, the previous pastor, Reverend Mitchell, had welcomed her with open arms. He baptized baby Maya when she was just 3 months old, and for Maya's first 8 years of life, the church felt like home. Maya was a precocious child with an infectious smile and an insatiable curiosity about everything, especially matters of faith. She memorized Bible verses faster than children twice her age, asked thoughtful questions during Sunday school, and had a singing voice that could make grown adults weep during the children's choir performances. But in the spring of 1991, Reverend Mitchell retired due to health issues. The church board, after months of searching, hired Pastor Robert Williams, a 45-year-old minister from Alabama, with impeccable credentials and glowing recommendations from his previous congregation. Pastor Williams was tall, imposing, and carried himself with the kind of authority that commanded instant respect. He had a deep, resonant voice that filled every corner of the sanctuary, and his sermons were passionate, fire and brimstone affairs that left congregants feeling both convicted and inspired. For the first few months, everything seemed normal. Pastor Williams was polite to everyone. His sermons were powerful, and attendance actually increased under his leadership. But Maya, with the intuitive wisdom that children sometimes possess, sensed something different about the way Pastor Williams looked at her family. It wasn't warmth or welcome, it was something colder, more calculating. The incident that would change Maya's life forever happened on a humid Sunday morning in August 1991. The church was packed for their annual Homecoming Sunday, a celebration that brought together current members and former congregants for a special service and fellowship meal. Maya had been looking forward to this day for weeks. She had been chosen to recite Psalm 23 during the service, and she had practiced until she could deliver it flawlessly. Her mother had saved up to buy her a new white dress with small blue flowers, and Maya felt beautiful and confident as they walked into the church that morning. The service began normally. The opening hymns were sung with more enthusiasm than usual. The prayers were longer and more heartfelt, and there was a buzz of excitement in the air. When it came time for Maya to recite her psalm, she walked confidently to the front of the church. Standing behind the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some visiting, Maya began, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Her voice was clear and strong, carrying the confidence of a child who truly believed the words she was speaking. She could see her mother in the third pew, beaming with pride. She could see Mrs. Henderson, her Sunday school teacher, nodding encouragingly. Everything was perfect. But then, as Maya reached the middle of the psalm, she noticed Pastor Williams approaching from the side. He wasn't smiling, his face was stern, almost angry. Maya faltered slightly, but continued, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Pastor Williams reached the podium and placed his hand on Maya's shoulder. Not gently, not encouragingly, but firmly, possessively. The congregation seemed to sense something was wrong. The energy in the room shifted. "That's enough," Pastor Williams said, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary's sound system. Maya looked up at him, confused. She wasn't finished. She still had 2 more verses to go. "But Pastor Williams, I'm not done yet," Maya whispered, thinking he had simply made a mistake. Pastor Williams leaned down, bringing his face close to Maya's. When he spoke, his voice was low, but clearly audible to the first several rows of congregants. "Some people don't belong in God's house, child, and you're one of them." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. She stood frozen, trying to process what she had just heard. Around her, she could hear the sharp intake of breath from several congregation members. She could see her mother half rising from her seat, her face a mask of shock and growing anger. Pastor Williams straightened up and addressed the congregation. "We'll continue with our regularly scheduled program. Mrs. Patterson, would you please lead us in hymn number 24? Maya remained at the podium for several more seconds, too stunned to move. The organist began playing the opening notes of Amazing Grace, but the singing was subdued, uncertain. Finally, Mrs. Henderson, Maya's Sunday school teacher, came forward and gently guided Maya back to her seat. The rest of the service passed in a blur. Maya sat beside her mother, feeling the heat of shame and confusion washing over her in waves. She kept replaying Pastor Williams' words, trying to understand what she had done wrong. She had practiced her psalm perfectly. She had worn her best dress. She had arrived on time and sat quietly during the opening prayers. What had she done to deserve such treatment? When the service ended, Janet Thompson took Maya's hand and walked straight up to Pastor Williams, who was greeting congregants at the back of the church. "Pastor Williams," Janet said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "I need to speak with you about what happened to my daughter today." Pastor Williams looked down at Janet with the same cold expression he had given Maya. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "I think it would be best if you and your daughter found another church home. Mount Calvary has certain standards and traditions that must be maintained." The words were spoken quietly, but several people overheard them. Maya watched as some congregation members looked away uncomfortably, while others nodded in agreement with their pastor. She felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, as if the very foundation of her world was crumbling. Janet's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "My daughter has been a member of this church since she was baptized as an infant. She has every right to be here." "Rights," Pastor Williams repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Mrs. Thompson, this is a house of worship, not a courthouse. We serve at the pleasure of the Lord, and the Lord has made it clear to me that your family would be happier elsewhere." That night, 8-year-old Maya lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what had happened. She had been rejected by her church, humiliated in front of the entire congregation, and told that she didn't belong in God's house. For a child whose faith had been the cornerstone of her identity, it was devastating. But what Maya didn't know that night was that Pastor Williams' rejection would plant a seed that would eventually grow into something powerful and transformative. She didn't know that his words of shame would become her motivation, his rejection would become her purpose, and his hatred would become the fuel for her greatest achievements. In the days following the incident at Mount Calvary, Maya's world felt turned upside down. She stopped eating regularly, had trouble sleeping, and kept asking her mother the same question over and over. "Mama, why don't I belong in God's house?" Janet Thompson was heartbroken watching her daughter struggle with such profound rejection. She had experienced racism throughout her life, but she had hoped to shield Maya from its ugliest manifestations for as long as possible. Now she was forced to have conversations with her 8-year-old daughter that no child should have to hear. "Baby," Janet said one evening, as they sat together on their small couch. What that man said to you had nothing to do with God and everything to do with the darkness in his own heart. God loves you exactly as you are, and don't you ever forget that. But Maya's questions went deeper than her mother's reassurances could reach. She began asking about the history of their town, about why there were so few black families at Mount Calvary, about whether other churches would welcome them. Over the following weeks, Janet made inquiries about other churches in the area. There was a small African Methodist Episcopal church about 20 miles away in the next town over, but transportation was a problem since Janet didn't own a car. There was also a Baptist church on the predominantly black side of Millfield, but it was much smaller and more financially strapped than Mount Calvary. During this period of church searching, Maya began to learn more about the complex racial dynamics of her hometown. She discovered that Millfield had been segregated until the late 1960s, that Mount Calvary had only begun accepting black members in 1975, and that there were still many people in town who viewed integration as a mistake. Mrs. Henderson, Maya's former Sunday school teacher, visited them at home one afternoon. She was a kind, elderly white woman who had taught at Mount Calvary for over 30 years, and her eyes were red with tears as she sat in their small living room. "Janet," she said, "I want you to know that what Pastor Williams did was wrong, dead wrong, and there are plenty of us at the church who feel the same way." "Then why didn't anyone speak up?" Janet asked, her voice harder than Maya had ever heard it. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. "Because we're cowards," she finally said. "We're comfortable cowards, who care more about keeping the peace than standing up for what's right, and I'm ashamed of that." She turned to Maya, who had been listening quietly from the doorway. "Sweetheart, I want you to know that God's house is big enough for everyone, and anyone who tells you otherwise is speaking from their own fear and hatred, not from God's love." Maya appreciated Mrs. Henderson's words, but the damage had been done. Her faith, which had once been simple and unquestioning, was now complicated by questions about how people could claim to follow Jesus while treating others with such cruelty. As the weeks turned into months, Maya and her mother eventually settled into a routine at the small AME church in the neighboring town. The congregation was warm and welcoming, and Maya slowly began to rebuild her relationship with faith and church community. But she never forgot the feeling of standing in front of Mount Calvary's congregation, being told she didn't belong in God's house. During this time, Maya also began to excel academically. It was as if Pastor Williams' rejection had awakened something fierce and determined within her. She threw herself into her schoolwork with an intensity that surprised her teachers. She read voraciously, asked challenging questions, and began to develop the intellectual confidence that would serve her throughout her life. By the time Maya reached middle school, she had become one of the top students in her grade. She joined the debate team, the student government, and the academic quiz bowl team. Teachers began to take notice of her potential, and several suggested that she might be college material, something that was still relatively rare for students from her socioeconomic background in rural Georgia. But even as Maya thrived academically, she carried the wound from Mount Calvary with her. Sometimes she would walk past the church on her way to school and feel a mixture of pain, anger, and something else she couldn't quite name. It wasn't until years later that she would recognize that feeling as determination. One particularly formative conversation happened when Maya was in 8th grade. She was walking home from school with her best friend, Ashley, when they passed Mount Calvary. Ashley, who was white and attended the church with her family, made an offhand comment about the upcoming Easter service. "You should come with us for Easter," Ashley said innocently. "Pastor Williams always does this amazing sunrise service." Maya stopped walking. "Ashley," she said carefully, "do you remember what happened to me at that church when we were little?" Ashley looked confused. "What do you mean?" Maya realized that Ashley had either forgotten the incident or had never fully understood its significance. She found herself telling the story again, watching as Ashley's face changed from confusion to shock to anger. "That's horrible," Ashley said. "I can't believe Pastor Williams said that to you. That's not what Jesus would do." "No," Maya agreed. "It's not." That conversation marked a turning point for Maya. She realized that many people in her community had either forgotten the incident or had never understood its full impact. She began to understand that her experience, while deeply personal, was also part of a larger pattern of injustice that needed to be addressed. It was around this time that Maya began to articulate a dream that would seem impossible to anyone who knew her circumstances. She wanted to go to college, study business and theology, and someday return to Millfield to make a difference. She didn't know exactly what that would look like, but she knew it had something to do with the church that had rejected her. Maya's high school years were marked by exceptional academic achievement and growing leadership skills, but also by increasing awareness of the limitations placed on her by her family's financial circumstances and the social dynamics of Millfield. As a sophomore, Maya was elected class president, became captain of the debate team, and maintained a 4.0 GPA while working part-time at the local grocery store to help her mother with expenses. College recruiters began to take notice, and Maya received several scholarship offers from state universities. However, Maya's success also attracted unwanted attention from some quarters of the community. Pastor Williams, who had been at Mount Calvary for nearly a decade by this point, had established himself as one of the town's most influential religious leaders. He served on the school board, led the annual prayer breakfast for local business leaders, and had significant sway over public opinion in Millfield. When Maya was selected as valedictorian of her graduating class, Pastor Williams used his position on the school board to question whether she was the right choice to represent the school at graduation. During a board meeting that Maya learned about only through local gossip, he reportedly argued that the valedictorian should reflect traditional Millfield values and suggested that Maya's confrontational attitude made her unsuitable for the honor. Maya's mother was furious when she heard about Pastor Williamson's interference. "That man is still trying to tear you down," Janet said. "He can't stand to see you succeed." But Maya's response surprised her mother. Instead of anger, Maya felt something closer to pity.
"Mama,"
she said, "he's afraid of me. He's afraid of what I represent and what I might become. And honestly, he should be." At 17, Maya had developed a clarity of purpose that was remarkable for her age. She understood that Pastor Williams' continued antagonism toward her was rooted in a fear that his worldview was being challenged by her very existence and success. She also understood that the best response to his attempts to limit her was to exceed every expectation and break every barrier he tried to place in her path. The graduation ceremony itself became a moment of quiet triumph for Maya. As she delivered her valedictorian speech to a packed auditorium, she spoke about the importance of education, the power of perseverance, and the responsibility each person has to lift others up. She never mentioned Mount Calvary or Pastor Williams directly, but everyone in the audience understood the subtext. "Sometimes," Maya said, looking out at the crowd, "the greatest gifts come disguised as rejections. Sometimes the doors that close in our faces are simply redirecting us toward doors that were meant to open. And sometimes the voices that tell us we don't belong are actually preparing us to create spaces where everyone belongs." In the audience, Mrs. Henderson, Maya's former Sunday school teacher, wiped tears from her eyes. Several other Mount Calvary members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. And in the back row, Janet Thompson beamed with pride at the young woman her daughter had become. Maya accepted a full scholarship to Georgia State University, where she planned to double major in business administration and theology. Her goal was clear. She wanted to understand both the practical and spiritual aspects of leadership so that she could return to Millfield and make a meaningful impact on her community. However, Maya's first year of college presented challenges she hadn't anticipated. The academic rigor was intense, and she struggled initially to keep up with students who had attended better-funded high schools. She also experienced culture shock in Atlanta, where the diversity and fast pace of city life was dramatically different from small-town Georgia. More significantly, Maya began to grapple with deeper questions about faith and justice that her rural upbringing hadn't prepared her to address. In theology classes, she encountered liberation theology, social gospel movements, and academic frameworks for understanding the intersection of race, religion, and power. These concepts gave her new language for her experiences, but also complicated her understanding of faith. During her sophomore year, Maya received news that would test her resolve and force her to confront her past more directly than she had expected. Pastor Williams had announced his intention to expand Mount Calvary's facilities and had launched a major capital campaign to build a new sanctuary and community center. The proposed expansion would make Mount Calvary one of the largest and most influential churches in the region. More troubling to Maya, Pastor Williams was positioning the expansion as a way to preserve traditional Christian values in an increasingly secular world. The coded language was clear to anyone who understood the dynamics of Millfield. Mount Calvary was doubling down on exclusivity rather than moving toward inclusion. Maya's mother called her with updates about the campaign's progress. He's raising money from churches all over the state, Janet reported. Apparently, he's become quite the celebrity in certain evangelical circles. They're calling him a defender of biblical truth. Maya felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. The idea that Pastor Williams was gaining regional influence and using that platform to promote exclusionary theology was deeply troubling. She began to realize that her personal grievance with Mount Calvary was part of a much larger struggle for the soul of American Christianity. During her junior year, Maya made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She decided to write her senior thesis on the history of racial integration in Southern Baptist churches, using Mount Calvary as a primary case study. This meant she would need to return to Millfield, conduct interviews with longtime church members, and analyze the congregation's response to integration over several decades. When Maya called her mother to explain her thesis project, Janet was concerned. "Baby, are you sure you want to dig all that up again? You've moved on from that place. Why go back and give them the power to hurt you again?" Maya had been asking herself the same question. "Mama," she said finally, "I don't think I've moved on. I think I've been running away, and I'm tired of running. If I'm going to understand what happened to me and why it still matters, I need to face it head on." The decision to return to Millfield and confront her past marked the beginning of the most challenging period of Maya's young adult life. She would need to interview people who had witnessed her humiliation, research the history of an institution that had rejected her, and face the man who had told her she didn't belong in God's house. But Maya had also begun to understand something important. Her story wasn't just about personal pain or individual triumph. It was about the broader struggle for justice, inclusion, and the true meaning of Christian faith. And that understanding would give her the courage to face whatever she might discover. Maya returned to Millfield during the summer before her senior year of college, armed with interview questions, research materials, and a determination to understand the full context of her childhood experience at Mount Calvary. She stayed with her mother in their same small apartment, but everything about the town felt different through her adult eyes. Her first interview was with Mrs. Henderson, now in her 70s but still sharp and willing to talk about the church's history. They met at the local diner, where Maya's mother still worked, and Mrs. Henderson brought a box of materials she had saved over the years: church bulletins, board meeting minutes, and correspondence that painted a picture of Mount Calvary's evolution from the 1960s through the 1990s. "Maya," Mrs. Henderson said, spreading the documents across the diner table, "what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, but you deserve to know the truth." She explained that Mount Calvary's decision to integrate in 1975 had not been motivated by Christian conviction, but by financial necessity. The church had been losing members to suburban congregations, and the remaining white families couldn't support the building's maintenance costs. The board had voted to welcome black families primarily to increase membership and revenue. "It was always conditional," Mrs. Henderson said sadly. The unspoken understanding was that black families could attend as long as they didn't challenge the existing power structure or expect equal representation in leadership. Maya learned that there had been other incidents over the years. Black children excluded from certain youth activities, families asked to sit in specific sections during special services, and subtle discouragement from participating in church governance. The pattern of exclusion she had experienced was systematic, not personal. But the most shocking revelation came when Mrs. Henderson showed Maya a letter dated 3 months before Pastor Williams arrived at Mount Calvary. The letter was from the denominational headquarters to the church's board of directors, recommending Pastor Williams specifically because of his experience managing integrated congregations and his ability to maintain appropriate boundaries while serving diverse communities. Maya stared at the letter, reading it several times before the full implication hit her. They hired him because they knew he would keep black families in their place? Mrs. Henderson nodded. "I'm afraid so, and Maya, there's something else you need to know. What happened to you that Sunday morning wasn't spontaneous. It was planned." Maya felt the diner spinning around her. "What do you mean, planned?" Mrs. Henderson reached into her box and pulled out another document, the handwritten notes from a board meeting held 2 weeks before the homecoming service where Maya had been humiliated. The notes, taken by the church secretary, included a discussion about maintaining the dignity of special services and ensuring that appropriate representatives were chosen for speaking roles. Maya's name was specifically mentioned in the notes. The board had discussed their discomfort with her growing prominence in the church, her involvement in the children's choir, her perfect attendance at Sunday school, and her obvious intelligence and confidence. Several board members had expressed concern that she was becoming too visible, and might give visitors the wrong impression about the church's character. The notes revealed that Pastor Williams had been instructed to address the situation before the homecoming service. His humiliation of Maya hadn't been a moment of personal prejudice, it had been a calculated decision by the church leadership to put her in her place in front of the largest possible audience. Maya sat in stunned silence, processing this information. The 8-year-old girl who had blamed herself for not being good enough, who had wondered what she had done wrong, finally understood that she had been the target of institutional racism disguised as pastoral authority. "Why are you showing me this now?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Henderson reached across the table and took Maya's hand. "Because you're strong enough to handle the truth now. And because I've carried the shame of my silence for 15 years. I should have spoken up that day. We all should have. Instead, we let that man destroy your childhood faith to protect our own comfort." Maya spent the next several days conducting more interviews with former Mount Calvary members, including some who had left the church after witnessing her treatment. The picture that emerged was of a congregation torn between genuine Christian conviction and deeply ingrained racial prejudice, led by a pastor who was skilled at managing these tensions to maintain his position and authority. She learned that Pastor Williams had used similar tactics with other black families over the years, never being overtly racist enough to generate official complaints, but consistently creating an atmosphere of conditional welcome that kept African American members from gaining real influence or leadership roles. The most painful interview was with her former friend Ashley, now married and living in Atlanta, but visiting her parents for the summer. Ashley remembered the homecoming service differently than Maya had expected. "I knew it was wrong when it happened," Ashley admitted. "Even as a kid, I could see how cruel it was, but my parents told me that Pastor Williams must have had his reasons, and I was taught to respect pastoral authority. I'm ashamed to say I believed them." Ashley also revealed something Maya hadn't known. Several families had quietly left Mount Calvary after witnessing Maya's humiliation, including some who had been longtime members. The church had actually lost membership and revenue in the months following the incident, though Pastor Williams had managed to rebuild by attracting more conservative families from surrounding areas. As Maya compiled her research, she began to understand that her personal story was part of a much larger pattern of how white evangelical churches had responded to integration throughout the South. Mount Calvary wasn't uniquely evil. It was representative of thousands of congregations that had maintained racial hierarchies through subtle exclusion rather than overt segregation. But this understanding, while academically valuable, was emotionally devastating. Maya had hoped that researching her experience would provide closure and help her move forward. Instead, it had revealed the calculated cruelty behind what she had experienced and the widespread complicity of people she had trusted and respected. The breaking point came when Maya decided to request an interview with Pastor Williams himself. She called the church office and explained that she was conducting academic research on the history of integration in Southern churches. Pastor Williams agreed to meet with her, apparently not recognizing her name or connecting her to the incident 15 years earlier. When Maya walked into Pastor Williams' office, now expanded and decorated with awards and commendations from various evangelical organizations, he greeted her professionally and offered her coffee. He had aged significantly since she last saw him, his hair now completely gray and his face more lined, but his bearing was still imposing and authoritative. "So, Miss Thompson," he said, settling behind his large desk, "you're interested in our church's history with integration. That's certainly an important topic." Maya had prepared carefully for this moment, but sitting across from the man who had shattered her childhood faith, she found herself struggling to maintain professional composure. "Yes, Pastor Williams, I'm particularly interested in the period from 1990 to 1995, when the church was navigating changing demographics and community expectations." For the next 20 minutes, Pastor Williams spoke eloquently about the challenges of leading a diverse congregation, the importance of maintaining theological integrity while welcoming all people, and his commitment to biblical truth over social pressure. He painted himself as a faithful shepherd who had protected Mount Calvary from the divisive influences of secular culture. Finally, Maya asked the question she had been building toward. "Pastor Williams, do you remember an incident in August 1991 involving a young girl who was reciting Psalm 23 during a homecoming service?" For the first time during the interview, Pastor Williams paused. His expression changed slightly, and Maya could see recognition dawning in his eyes. "Miss Thompson," he said slowly, "you're Janet Thompson's daughter." "Yes," Maya said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm the little girl you told didn't belong in God's house." The silence in the office stretched for what felt like an eternity. Pastor Williams stared at Maya, clearly trying to decide how to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its pastoral warmth. "That was a long time ago," he said. "I don't recall the specific details, but I'm sure whatever happened was motivated by appropriate pastoral concerns." Maya felt 15 years of pain and anger crystallizing into a moment of perfect clarity. "Pastor Williams," she said, "I know about the board meeting. I know about the planning. I know that what you did to me was deliberate and calculated, and I know that you've continued to use your position to exclude and marginalize people who don't fit your narrow definition of acceptable Christianity." Pastor Williams' face hardened. "Miss Thompson, I think this interview is over. If you intend to write something inflammatory about this church, I'll have my lawyer review it before publication." Maya stood up, gathering her materials. "Pastor Williams, I'm not here to destroy you or this church. I'm here to understand how people who claim to follow Jesus can treat children the way you treated me. And I'm here to let you know that despite your best efforts, you didn't destroy my faith or my future. In fact, you gave me the motivation to become everything you told me I could never be." As Maya walked toward the door, Pastor Williams called after her. "And what exactly is that, Miss Thompson?" Maya turned back, and for the first time since entering his office, she smiled. "Someone who owns something you want but can never have, the moral authority to speak for God's love instead of your fear." That night, Maya sat in her childhood bedroom, staring at the research materials spread across her desk. She had the truth she had been seeking, but she wasn't sure what to do with it. The academic thesis would be completed and filed away in a university library. But Maya was beginning to understand that her real calling was something much larger and more transformative than a college paper. Maya completed her senior thesis, which became one of the most widely circulated papers in her university's theology department. But more importantly, the research process had clarified her life's purpose in ways she hadn't expected. She graduated summa cum laude and was accepted to several prestigious divinity schools, but she made a decision that surprised everyone. She chose to attend a small seminary in Atlanta that specialized in social justice theology and community organizing. Over the next 3 years, Maya immersed herself in studying the intersection of faith, race, and economic justice. She worked with urban churches, participated in community development projects, and learned practical skills in nonprofit management and fundraising. But throughout her seminary education, she kept thinking about Millfield and Mount Calvary. Maya's mother noticed the change in her daughter during visits home. "You're different," Janet observed during Maya's second year of seminary. "More focused, more determined. What are you planning, baby?" Maya had been asking herself the same question. "Mama, what if I told you I was thinking about coming back to Millfield after graduation?" Janet looked alarmed. "Maya, you've got opportunities in Atlanta and New York and places where your talents would be appreciated. Why would you want to come back to a town that tried to keep you down?" "Because," Maya said, "I think God is calling me back here, and I think I'm finally ready to answer that call." After graduating from seminary, Maya took a position as assistant pastor at a progressive church in Atlanta while she developed her plans for returning to Millfield. She spent 2 years building her experience, establishing connections with potential funders, and developing a comprehensive vision for faith-based community development. Maya's plan was ambitious. She wanted to establish a nonprofit organization that would address economic inequality, educational disparities, and social justice issues in rural Georgia communities. She envisioned a faith-based approach that would bring together people across racial and denominational lines to work on practical solutions to poverty and discrimination. But Maya also had a more specific goal that she shared with no one except her mother. She wanted to purchase and transform a significant property in Millfield that could serve as headquarters for her organization, and she had her eye on one particular building. Mount Calvary Baptist Church had continued to struggle financially, despite Pastor Williams' efforts to expand the congregation. The ambitious building campaign of the late 1990s had left the church with significant debt, and membership had declined steadily as younger families moved away from Millfield and older members passed away. By 2015, the congregation averaged fewer than 100 people on Sundays, and the church was having difficulty maintaining the large facility. Maya had been quietly monitoring Mount Calvary's financial situation through public records and conversations with people still connected to the church. She learned that Pastor Williams was nearing retirement and that the denomination was considering closing the Millfield location and merging the remaining members with a larger church in the county seat. In 2016, Maya made her move. She returned to Millfield and established the South Georgia Faith and Justice Initiative, renting a small office space on Main Street and beginning to build relationships with community leaders. Her approach was deliberately low-key and collaborative rather than confrontational. Maya organized community forums on education, established a scholarship fund for local students, and created job training programs that brought together participants from different racial and economic backgrounds. She was careful to build credibility and trust before revealing her larger ambitions. The response to Maya's work was overwhelmingly positive. Even people who remembered the incident at Mount Calvary 25 years earlier were impressed by her professionalism, her commitment to the community, and her ability to bring people together around shared concerns. Mrs. Henderson, now in her 80s, became one of Maya's strongest supporters. "That girl has more Christian love in her little finger than most of us have in our whole bodies," she told anyone who would listen. "She's doing what the church should have been doing all along." As Maya's organization grew and gained recognition, she began to hear rumors that Mount Calvary was actively exploring the sale of their building. The congregation could no longer afford the maintenance costs, and Pastor Williams was facing pressure from the denominational leadership to either revitalize the church or close it. Maya spent months researching the legal and financial aspects of purchasing church property. She consulted with lawyers, accountants, and real estate professionals to understand the process and potential complications. More importantly, she began quietly building a coalition of supporters who could help fund the purchase. The irony wasn't lost on Maya that many of her potential supporters were former Mount Calvary members who had left the church over the years due to disagreements with Pastor Williams' leadership style and theological positions. These families, now scattered across Georgia and beyond, were eager to support Maya's vision for transforming the building into a center for community service and inclusive faith. Maya also received support from unexpected sources. Several prominent African-American churches in Atlanta pledged financial backing, as did progressive white congregations, who saw Maya's project as a powerful symbol of redemption and racial reconciliation. A wealthy philanthropist who had grown up in rural Georgia but made his fortune in technology committed to matching donations up to $500,000. By early 2017, Maya had raised enough money to make a serious offer on the Mount Calvary property, but she wanted to handle the negotiation carefully, both to ensure she got the building and to make the process as healing as possible for everyone involved. Maya's first step was to approach the denominational leadership rather than Pastor Williams directly. She met with the regional superintendent, a pragmatic man in his 60s who was more interested in finding a solution to the Mount Calvary situation than in protecting anyone's ego. "Miss Thompson," the superintendent said after Maya explained her proposal, "I have to ask, given your history with Pastor Williams, are you sure this is about ministry and not revenge?" Maya had anticipated this question. "Superintendent Johnson, if I wanted revenge, I would have pursued it years ago when I had the power to embarrass Pastor Williams publicly. Instead, I've spent the last decade building skills and resources so I could offer a constructive solution to a problem that's bigger than any one person's prejudices." She outlined her vision for the building, a community center that would offer educational programs, job training, childcare, and meeting space for various community organizations. The sanctuary would be preserved and used for inclusive worship services, interfaith dialogue, and cultural events. The building would truly become what it had always claimed to be, a place where everyone was welcome in God's house. The denominational leadership was impressed by Maya's proposal and her funding commitments. They agreed to facilitate negotiations with the Mount Calvary board, with the understanding that the congregation would have input into the terms of sale, but couldn't veto a financially sound offer. When Pastor Williams learned about Maya's interest in purchasing the building, his reaction was predictably hostile. He called an emergency board meeting and argued passionately against selling to someone he described as a known agitator with a personal vendetta against this church. But Pastor Williams' influence had waned significantly over the years. The board was tired of struggling with financial problems, and several members had been quietly supportive of Maya's community work. More importantly, they recognized that Maya's offer was likely the best and possibly the only realistic option for ensuring the building's preservation and continued use for community purposes. The negotiations took several months, with Maya demonstrating remarkable patience and grace throughout the process. She agreed to preserve certain historical elements of the building, to allow the current congregation to continue meeting in the sanctuary for 6 months, while they transitioned to a new location, and to name the community center in honor of the church's positive contributions to Millfield over the decades. Maya also made a gesture that surprised everyone, including herself. She asked that a small memorial garden be created on the property to honor all the pastors who had served Mount Calvary over the years, including Pastor Williams. When asked about this decision, Maya explained, "Healing doesn't come from erasing history. It comes from acknowledging the full truth of what happened and choosing to move forward with love instead of hatred." The sale was finalized in September 2017. Maya stood in the empty sanctuary, holding the deed to the building where she had been told she didn't belong, and felt a complex mixture of emotions: triumph, sadness, hope, and a deep sense of God's presence. But Maya's story wasn't complete yet. The real test would come in transforming the building and the community it served. She had purchased more than a piece of property. She had taken on the responsibility of proving that faith, when properly understood and practiced, could indeed create spaces where everyone belonged. As Maya stood in the sanctuary of Mount Calvary Baptist Church, now the South Georgia Faith and Justice Center, on a rainy evening in October 2017, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 26 years had passed since Pastor Williams told her she didn't belong in God's house. Now she owned God's house, and her first act as owner was to ensure it would welcome everyone. The transformation of the building took 8 months. Maya worked with architects and contractors to preserve the sanctuary's historic beauty while making the rest of the facility accessible and functional for community programs. The stained glass windows were restored, the sanctuary was updated with modern sound and lighting systems, and the fellowship hall was converted into a multi-purpose space for educational and cultural events. But more important than the physical transformation was the spiritual and social transformation Maya was facilitating in Millfield. The South Georgia Faith and Justice Center quickly became a hub of community activity, hosting everything from voter registration drives to job training programs to interfaith dialogue sessions. Maya's approach to leadership was deliberately different from what the community had experienced before. Instead of positioning herself as the sole authority figure, she created collaborative leadership structures that brought together people from different backgrounds and perspectives. The center's board included former Mount Calvary members, leaders from the Black church community, business owners, educators, and community activists. The most powerful moment of Maya's transformation came during the center's official dedication ceremony in June 2018. Maya had invited Pastor Williams to attend, along with all the former pastors of Mount Calvary and community leaders from across the region. She wasn't sure if Pastor Williams would come, but she felt it was important to extend the invitation. To everyone's surprise, Pastor Williams attended the ceremony. Now in his 70s and recently retired, he sat in the back of the sanctuary as Maya delivered the dedication address. His presence created a tension that everyone in the room could feel, but Maya addressed it directly in her remarks. 27 years ago, Maya said, looking out at the packed sanctuary, a little girl stood in this same spot and was told she didn't belong in God's house. That moment could have been the end of her story. It could have destroyed her faith and limited her possibilities. Instead, it became the beginning of a journey that has led us all to this moment. Maya paused, looking directly at Pastor Williams. "I want to thank Pastor Williams for attending today. I know this isn't easy for him, and I respect his willingness to be here. I also want to say something that might surprise you. I'm grateful for what happened to me in this sanctuary all those years ago." A murmur of surprise rippled through the congregation. Maya continued, "I'm not grateful for the pain or the humiliation. I'm not grateful for the damage that was done to a child's faith. But I am grateful for the way that experience shaped my understanding of justice, my commitment to inclusion, and my determination to create spaces where everyone truly belongs." She gestured to the diverse crowd filling the sanctuary. "Look around you. This room is filled with people from different races, different denominations, different economic backgrounds, different political perspectives. We're all here because we believe in the possibility of beloved community, of faith that unites rather than divides, of God's house being big enough for everyone." Maya's voice grew stronger as she reached the climax of her address. The little girl who was told she didn't belong in God's house grew up to understand a fundamental truth. God's house isn't a building. It's not an institution. It's not controlled by any one person or group. God's house is wherever people gather in love, in justice, in hope, and in commitment to lifting each other up. As Maya concluded her remarks, something unexpected happened. Pastor Williams stood up from his seat in the back of the sanctuary. The room fell silent as he walked slowly toward the front of the church. Maya watched him approach, unsure of what was about to happen. When Pastor Williams reached the podium, he asked quietly, "May I say something?" Maya nodded and stepped aside. Pastor Williams looked out at the congregation, his face showing the weight of his years and the complexity of his emotions. "I came here today," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "because I needed to see what Maya Thompson has accomplished. I needed to understand what she has built in this place where I once served as pastor." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "What I see here today is what this church should have been all along. What I see is the kingdom of God made manifest in a way that I was too blind, too fearful, and too proud to recognize or create." Pastor Williams turned to Maya, who was standing to the side of the podium. "Maya, I owe you an apology that is 27 years overdue. What I did to you was wrong. It was cruel, it was unchristian, and it was inexcusable. I told you that you didn't belong in God's house, but the truth is that I was the one who didn't understand what God's house was supposed to be." The sanctuary was completely silent except for the sound of people crying. Maya felt tears streaming down her own face as she listened to the words she had never expected to hear. "I can't undo the harm I caused," Pastor Williams continued. "I can't give you back your childhood faith or take away the pain I inflicted, but I can tell you and everyone here that you have become everything a pastor should be. A person who creates space for others to encounter God's love, who fights for justice, who builds beloved community. You have been a better pastor in this building than I ever was." Maya walked over to Pastor Williams, and in a gesture that surprised everyone, including herself, embraced him. It wasn't a moment of complete reconciliation. Some wounds go too deep for that, but it was a moment of recognition, of shared humanity, of the possibility of redemption even in the most broken situations. The ceremony concluded with the entire congregation singing Amazing Grace, the same hymn that had been playing when 8-year-old Maya was led away from the podium in humiliation. But now the song had a different meaning. It was a celebration of grace that had indeed been amazing, grace that had taken a moment of rejection and transformed it into a foundation for justice, grace that had taken a little girl's broken heart and grown it into a heart big enough to embrace even those who had hurt her. As the last notes of the hymn faded away, Maya looked around the sanctuary one more time. The stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across the diverse faces of the congregation. Children from different racial backgrounds played together in the pews. Former enemies sat side by side, united in their commitment to building a better community. Maya had accomplished more than purchasing a building or even transforming a community. She had proven that the voice of love is always stronger than the voice of hatred, that rejection can become the foundation for inclusion, and that God's house is indeed big enough for everyone. The little girl who was told she didn't belong had grown up to create a place where everyone belonged, and in doing so, she had answered the question that had haunted her for so many years. She had always belonged in God's house, because God's house was wherever she chose to build it. As the congregation filed out of the sanctuary that evening, Maya remained behind for a few minutes, standing in the place where her journey had begun. The rain had stopped, and evening sunlight was streaming through the stained glass windows, painting the sanctuary in brilliant colors. Maya whispered a prayer of gratitude for the pain that had shaped her, for the people who had supported her, for the opportunity to transform rejection into redemption, and for the amazing grace that had brought her home. The South Georgia Faith and Justice Center continues to serve the Millfield community today, a testament to the power of faith to transform even the deepest wounds into sources of healing and hope. And Maya Thompson continues to pastor in the truest sense of the word, creating spaces where everyone knows they belong in God's house. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding our pain, but from walking straight through it toward the light on the other side. Sometimes the voices that tell us we don't belong are simply preparing us to create places where everyone does. And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very brave, we get the chance to transform the very place that broke us into a place that heals others. Maya's story reminds us that redemption is always possible, that love is always stronger than hatred, and that God's house is always big enough for everyone who enters with an open heart and a commitment to justice. The little girl who was rejected at Mount Calvary Baptist Church grew up to show the world what Mount Calvary Baptist Church and every house of worship was always meant to be. Her story is still being written, one act of love and justice at a time, and somewhere in Millfield, Georgia, in a beautiful sanctuary filled with stained glass windows and the sounds of children laughing, everyone knows they belong in God's house.